Some men find out who their wife really is during a catastrophe, a house fire, a serious diagnosis, something large and undeniable that forces a person to reveal their character all at once, whether they want to or not. I did not have that. What I had was a Thursday evening in October, a pot of pasta on the stove, and 4 words spoken over a kitchen counter by a woman I had been married to for 23 years. 4 words. And in those 4 words, I could see my entire marriage the way you can sometimes see the whole shape of a room when someone opens a door at the end of a dark hallway. Everything illuminated, all at once, whether you were ready for it or not. My name is Gerald Hutton. I am 67 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the same house I bought in 1991 when the market was soft, and I had just enough saved to put 15% down on a 2-story colonial on Elmwood Drive. The furnace has been replaced twice. The roof once. I know every creak in every floorboard, and I intend to die knowing them. I am a retired civil engineer. I spent 31 years working for the Ohio Department of Transportation, designing drainage infrastructure, culverts, retention basins, stormwater diversion systems, the kind of work that keeps streets from flooding and rivers from overrunning their banks. Work that most people never think about until something fails. I was good at it, not brilliant. I was never the man who invented anything, but thorough and patient and relentless about documentation. I retired in August of 2019 with a full pension and a departmental commendation that I accepted at a luncheon and then put in a drawer because I have never been comfortable with that kind of attention. Since retirement, I have spent my time doing 3 things. I tend a vegetable garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, a row of pole beans that got away from me last summer and became something I can only describe as ambitious. I restore a 1978 Ford F-150 in the garage, blue over white, that I found in an estate sale in Hillier for $4,200 and have been slowly bringing back to the condition it deserves. And I take care of my mother. Welcome to Dad's Royal Revenge. Get settled because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My mother's name is Evelyn Ruth Hutton. She is 84 years old and she lives in a 1-bedroom apartment at the Broadview Place complex on the east side, approximately 11 minutes from my house without traffic and 14 with. She moved there in the spring of 2017, about 8 months after my father passed. The family home in Worthington, a 4-bedroom on Carolyn Drive that she and my father had lived in for 41 years, became too much for her alone. She decided that herself. She did not want help deciding it, and she did not want to be talked out of it or into anything else. And I respected that because she is a woman who has always known her own mind, and I was raised to take that seriously. She did not want to move in with us. She was very clear about that. She said she had spent 56 years keeping her own house, and she intended to keep one as long as her legs held out, even if it was smaller. What she wanted was to be close. The Broadview Place apartment put her close. She has a 2nd-floor unit with a window that looks out over a small courtyard and a parking lot with a large oak tree in the corner that she mentions every fall when the color comes in. She drives a 2009 Honda Civic, silver, that she has kept in careful condition. She stopped driving on highways 2 years ago, her own decision, not anyone else's suggestion, and uses a car for church on Sunday mornings, the Kroger on Livingston Avenue, and the occasional trip to her friend Dorothy's house on the near east side. For anything further, specialist appointments, labs, the cardiologist on East Broad Street, she calls me. This has been the arrangement for 7 years. It is a good arrangement. I do not experience it as a burden. I experience it as a minimum a decent son does, and I am aware that plenty of men in this city are doing considerably less. My wife, Diane, has always been aware of this arrangement. I want to say that plainly. She has never been asked to participate in it in any significant way. I have never asked her to drive my mother anywhere, never asked her to attend an appointment, never asked her to make a meal or sit in a waiting room or do a single thing that could be classified as caregiving. What I have occasionally asked, twice, maybe 3 times over 7 years, is for a minor accommodation, borrowing a car, covering a phone call, a 60-minute overlap, things that require less effort than returning a library book. I want you to hold that number. Twice, maybe 3 times. In 7 years. Diane and I were married in June of 2001. She was 41. I was 43. Neither of us had been married before. She has a daughter from a long relationship in her 20s, Lauren, who is now 38 and lives in Charlotte and works in pharmaceutical sales and calls on birthdays and Thanksgivings and occasionally sends a card. Lauren is a good person. She and I have always gotten along fine. She visits once a year, usually in the fall, and we eat well and watch football, and she flies back on Sunday morning. Diane works as the office manager for a dental group on Henderson Road, a 3-dentist practice she has been with for 16 years. She is organized and efficient, and she is the kind of person who keeps the refrigerator shelved in a way that makes sense. She has friends she sees regularly, a Tuesday book club, a Thursday yoga class, a rotating group of women from her former workplace who do dinner on the second Saturday of every month. Her life has structure, and she moves through it with purpose. I have never resented any of this. I say this not defensively, but because it is the truth. For most of our marriage, Diane's self-sufficiency was something I admired. What I did not fully understand until October 9th was a difference between self-sufficiency and a carefully maintained policy of non-involvement. Those are not the same thing. I had confused them for years. That confusion was mine. I own it. The first real anchor in this story is not the attorney and not the legal pad. It is my coffee maker. A Cuisinart 12-cup drip machine that I found at a yard sale on Bryden Road in the summer of 2017 for $8. The carafe has a crack in the handle that I repair with a 2-part epoxy, and which is held for 6 years, which tells you something about either the epoxy or my repair work, and I like to think both. I make coffee in it every morning at 6:15. I drink the first cup standing at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard, at the garden and the fence in the garage, and it is the quietest part of my day. On the morning of October 9th, I made that coffee and stood at that window and watched a squirrel make 3 trips across the fence with something it found in the garden, and I did not know that by the time I put that cup in the dishwasher that night, everything would be different. The call from my mother came at 6:47 in the evening. I was in the garage working on the passenger side door of the F-150. The hinge pin had worn and the door had developed a sag. Not dramatic, maybe 3/8 of an inch low at the latch end, but enough that it didn't close cleanly and the sound it made was wrong. It had been on my list for 2 weeks. I had the door propped and the hinge disassembled, and my hands were dark with grease when my phone buzzed on the workbench next to a can of penetrating oil and a folded shop rag. I picked it up on the second ring. My mother said, "Gerald, I hate to bother you." She has said that my entire life. Every phone call that begins with a request of any kind begins with "I hate to bother you." I have told her 100 times that she is not bothering me. It makes no difference. She says it anyway, and I think she will say it until she can't say anything anymore, and when that day comes I will miss it more than I can currently calculate. I wiped my right hand on the shop rag and said, "You're not bothering me, Mom. What do you need?" She told me she had gone to see Dr. Simmons that afternoon. Dr. Patricia Simmons, her cardiologist, practices out of a medical building on East Broad Street, about 4 miles from my mother's apartment. The appointment had been on the calendar for 3 weeks, a standard 6-month follow-up on her heart function and her medication levels. My mother had driven herself because there was no reason she couldn't drive herself to East Broad Street in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. What she had not anticipated was that Dr. Simmons, after reviewing her latest blood work, had wanted to run a supplemental EKG and then spend 20 minutes on the phone with a colleague at Ohio State Medical regarding a reading she wanted a second opinion on. None of this indicated an emergency. Dr. Simmons had been clear about that, my mother told me, but had pushed the appointment 90 minutes past its scheduled end. By the time my mother walked back to the parking lot, it was 6:34 p.m. The sky was going dark. The temperature had dropped to 49 degrees. She had been sitting in that lot, she said, for a few minutes, and she was just tired in a way that made her not want to drive. She said it carefully, the way she says things she is uncertain she has the right to say. I said, "Of course. Give me 15 minutes. I hung up and went inside. My car, a 2016 Chevrolet Malibu, gray, 74,000 miles on it, was not in the driveway. It was at Riverside Auto on Sullivan Avenue because the Serpentine belt had begun squealing 2 days before, and I had dropped it off at 7:30 that morning. In the focus of the phone call, I had simply forgotten. I came into the kitchen, and Diane was at the counter with her laptop open and a pot of pasta at a low boil on the stove, and I said, "Mom needs a ride from her cardiologist on East Broad. She's tired. My car's at the shop. Can I take yours?" Diane did not look up immediately. She was typing something or finishing reading something. I waited. The pasta pot made a slow bubbling sound. Then she looked up. She said, "She's your mother, Gerald. Not my problem." She said it the way a person says something they have said many times in their own head. There was no heat in it, no sharpness, exactly. Just a sound of position stated, finished, returned to. She looked back at her laptop. I stood at the edge of the kitchen for a moment. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think it is important. It was not what I would have expected. There was no surge of anger, no impulse to say something. What happened was quieter and stranger than either of those things. Something in me went very still. The way water goes still after you've dropped something in it, and the last ring has finally reached the edge of the pond. A specific kind of cold, flat quiet, not emptiness. Clarity. I said, "Okay." I walked out the front door and went next door to Don Calhoun's house. Don is 71 years old, retired from a career as a master electrician with the city, and the kind of man who has never once in 20 years of being my neighbor made me feel like I was putting him out. I knocked on his door at 6:51 p.m. I told him my car was at the shop and my mother needed a ride, and asked if I could borrow his truck. He pulled the keys to his 2014 Ram 1500 off the hook by the door without asking a single question. He said, "Tell Evelyn I said hello. Drive safe." I drove to East Broad Street. I found my mother sitting on a wooden bench outside the entrance to the medical building with her purse held in both hands in her lap, and her gray wool coat buttoned to the collar. She had been there since 6:38 p.m. It was now 7:09. It was 48 degrees, and the wind had come up a little off the Scioto. She stood when she saw the headlights. She looked at the truck with a small frown and said, "Whose is this?" I said, "Don's. I forgot my car was in the shop." She nodded and let me help her up into the cab. We drove mostly in silence except for her asking about the F-150 door and me telling her it was close, but the hinge pin had been harder to source than I had expected. She fell asleep in her recliner around 9:15. I turned the lamp off on her side table, locked the apartment door behind me with my spare key, and drove Don's truck back to his driveway. I knocked twice to let him know it was back. He cracked the door and nodded and said goodnight. I pulled into my own driveway at 11:04 p.m. The house was lit in the back. The bedroom light was on. I sat in the driveway for a moment with the Malibu's engine quiet. The garage was dark. The garden was dark. The whole street was quiet. I went inside through the side door into the kitchen. The pasta pot was washed and drying in the rack. The counter was clean. The laptop was gone. I stood at the counter and looked at the coffee maker and the dark window above the sink, and I did not go upstairs. I went in my office off the hallway, sat down at the desk, and opened the top right drawer. I keep a yellow legal pad there. I have kept one there since 2008, the year my father was first diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia that would develop over 8 years into the congestive heart failure that killed him. I started keeping the pad because I am an engineer and engineers document things, and because I had learned early in my father's illness that memory is unreliable under emotional weight, and that a written record of who said what and when is worth more than any amount of recalled conversation. I wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, October 9th. The time, 11:09 p.m. And then I wrote in my regular handwriting the exact sentence, "She's your mother, Gerald. Not my problem." I read it back once. Then I closed the pad and went to bed. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I did not make a decision that night. I want to be precise about that. What happened on October 9th was not a decision. It was a recording. The decision came later, after the record had more pages, after I had sat with it long enough to be certain I was seeing clearly and not just reacting. I spent 31 years in engineering, and the first rule, not a guideline, a rule, is that you do not change a system while it is under load. You stabilize. You document. You assess the full picture. Then you decide. Over the 3 weeks that followed October 9th, I added 6 more entries to the legal pad. October 14th, a Saturday, my mother had a follow-up lab draw scheduled at Ohio Health on Riverside Drive at 10:30 a.m. I had arranged to pick up the Malibu from Sullivan Avenue at 11 o'clock. The timing worked if someone could be with my mother for 30 minutes while I drove over and back. I asked Diane at breakfast if she would be willing to sit with Mom in the Ohio Health waiting area for half an hour. Diane said she had plans with her friend Joanne. I looked at my phone. It was a Saturday with nothing on the calendar that I could see. I did not argue. I noted it on the pad. Time, 8:14 a.m. October 19th, a Thursday. My mother called at 2:15 in the afternoon. She had received her Medicare Advantage renewal documents, and there were 2 pages she did not understand. Specifically, a change to her supplemental benefit structure that she was worried might affect her prescription coverage. It was a legitimate concern. I was on a call with my former colleague Pete Wesson about a stormwater project in Franklin County that he wanted my input on. The call was running long. I stepped away and asked Diane, who was home, I could hear the television in the other room, if she could just stay on the phone with my mother for 10 minutes, read her the relevant sections, and let her know I would call back within the hour. Diane said she didn't understand Medicare paperwork. I went back to my call. Later, I sat with my mother for 40 minutes and walked her through the document. She was fine. I noted the Thursday exchange on the pad anyway. October 23rd, a Sunday. My mother came for dinner, as she does most Sundays. She arrived at 1:30 and Diane made a roast chicken that was good, as it always is. Diane is a competent cook, and Sunday dinners have always been the most functional part of our week. During dinner, my mother mentioned, in passing, that the weather had been hard on her hip and that the stairs to her second-floor apartment had been difficult earlier in the week. She was not complaining. She mentioned it the way she mentions things. Factually, briefly, without expectation. Diane set down her fork and said, "Evelyn, have you thought about looking into assisted living? There's some very nice facilities over on Sawmill Road." My mother looked at Diane for a moment and then changed the subject to the weather. I finished my meal and did not say anything. That night, I sat at the kitchen table until 1:47 in the morning. I made a pot of coffee at 11 p.m. that I did not drink. I let it go cold. I sat with the legal pad open in front of me, and I read every entry from October 9th to October 23rd. And then I turned back and read entries from 2013 and 2015 and 2018. Entries I had made over the years that I had never connected to anything larger, moments I had recorded simply out of habit and then filed away. A comment Diane had made after my father's funeral about the timing of the estate paperwork. A phone call from my mother in 2016 that Diane had picked up and handed to me without speaking into it. A Christmas Eve when my mother had called from her car in our driveway because she wasn't sure she had the right house, and Diane had not heard the phone. I sat with all of it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that kitchen at 1:47 in the morning, because I think it would be easy to tell this as a story about anger, and I want to be clear that it was not that. It was grief, not the dramatic, wet-faced kind, the dry kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed years ago that has finally settled to the bottom. I had loved Diane. That is not a figure of speech. I had loved her in the steady, daily way that older people love. Not with urgency, not with performance, but with a quiet and persistent commitment to her presence in my life. I had believed, without ever examining the belief carefully, that she held a similar commitment to mine. Sitting at that table in the dark, reading those pages, I understood that I had been wrong about that for a long time, and that the correct response to being wrong is not to stay wrong. At 1:47 a.m., I closed the legal pad. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. I went to my office and opened my laptop and found the email address I was looking for in my contacts. I wrote a brief, factual message. I said I needed to review some estate documents and discuss potential amendments, and asked if Thursday of that week was available for a meeting. I said I could come to the office or he was welcome to come to the house. I hit send at 1:52 a.m. His reply was in my inbox when I woke up at 6:15. He said Thursday at 2 p.m. worked and that he would come to me if I preferred. I said the house was fine. My attorney was confirmed by Thursday morning. His name is Thomas Eckhart. He has been my attorney since 2004, when he helped me and my father establish the living trust for my mother's long-term care. He is 62 years old, a sole practitioner with an office on Dublin Granville Road, and he is the kind of attorney who wears the same 4 suits in rotation and keeps all of his files in manila folders inside a leather briefcase that is, I would estimate, older than most of his active client relationships. He does not have a receptionist. He answers his own phone. He charges $195 an hour, which he has not raised since 2018, and which I have never once contested. I had driven to his office on Wednesday, October 25th, at 9 a.m. I sat across from his desk and placed a yellow legal pad on the table between us. I did not hand it to him immediately. I said, I want to review the living trust of my mother, and I also want to look at my personal will. I may want to make changes to both. He looked at the legal pad. He said, Is that the documentation? I said it was. He said, How long have you been keeping it? I said since October 9 for the current matter, but that there were earlier entries going back to 2008 if he thought them relevant. He nodded slowly. He has a particular kind of nod, unhurried, inward, the nod of a man who is absorbing rather than responding. He said, Walk me through the trust structure first. I walked him through it. The revocable living trust my father and I had established in 2004, naming my mother as primary beneficiary. The assets it covered: the family home in Worthington, sold in 2017 for $214,000, a Vanguard investment account that had grown to approximately $267,400 at the time of our meeting, and a whole life insurance policy with a face value of $85,000 that my father had taken out in 1978 and kept current until he died. I was named trustee as successive beneficiary. Upon my mother's death, any remaining trust assets would transfer to me. I then described my personal will, the document I had last updated in 2002, 1 year before Diane, and I were married. Under that will, Diane was named primary beneficiary of the full estate, the house on Elmwood Drive, my Oprah's pension, a separate investment account currently holding $118,700, and the F-150. My mother was listed as secondary beneficiary of one specific savings account I had ring-fenced for her care. Thomas listened with his hands folded and his eyes steady. When I was finished, he said, What do you want to do? I said I wanted to understand what I could change and what the process required. He said a revocable living trust was, by definition, revocable. I could amend the successor beneficiary designation at any time of the signed and notarized trust amendment. Ohio law required no notice to any existing beneficiary. Not before, not after. A will was similarly fully revocable. I could execute a new will at any time I chose, superseding the 2002 document entirely. Both could be drafted and ready for signature within 48 hours. I asked what he needed from me to proceed. He said a written statement of my intentions for each document, which he would use to draft the amendments, and then my signature before notary, him, or anyone licensed in Ohio. Upon review, he said he would have drafts by Thursday morning and could bring them to house at 2 p.m. if that worked. I said that worked. We shook hands. I drove back to Elmwood Drive in Malibu, turned into the driveway, and sat for a moment with the engine off. The garage door was closed. The garden was brown and finished for the season. Everything looked the way it had always looked. I went inside and washed my hands and made coffee. Thomas Eckhart parked his gray 2018 Volvo V60 in my driveway at 2:02 p.m. on Thursday, October 26. He came to the front door with a leather briefcase and a manila folder I could see was thicker than usual. Diane was at work. She would not be home before 5:30. He set the briefcase on the kitchen table and laid out 3 documents: the trust amendment, the new will, a 1-page summary he had prepared for my reference during review. He poured himself the coffee I had waiting, and we went through each document methodically, The way two men who have been working together for 20 years go through documents. No performance, no rushing, just precision. The trust amendment redirected the successive beneficiary designation away from my personal estate and established, upon my mother's passing, a charitable remainder trust in her name. The residual assets, whatever remained in the trust after her care expenses, would go to the Ohio Cardiac Research Foundation. My father had died of congestive heart failure. My mother had spent years donating small amounts to cardiac research when she could afford to. It seemed to me the right thing. The new will was careful and complete. I removed Diane as primary beneficiary entirely. In her place, I named my mother as primary beneficiary of the Elmwood Drive house, with a provision allowing her to occupy it, rent it, or direct its sale at her sole discretion. My investment account, $118,700 at the time of signing, I divided into 3 equal portions, one to my mother's care trust, one to Lauren, Diane's daughter, whom I had always considered a decent young woman who had nothing to do with her mother's choices, and one to a college savings account I was establishing for Maya Calhoun, age 9, the granddaughter of my neighbor Don. Don had handed me his truck keys without a single question on a cold October evening. I did not forget things like that. I believe in accounting for them, while I still can. Diane was not mentioned in the new will. She received nothing. I read both documents twice. Slowly. I asked Thomas 2 clarifying questions, one about the trust amendment's effective date, one about the portability of the college savings designation if Maya's family moved out of state. He answered both to my satisfaction. I signed the trust amendment at 2:41 p.m. and the new will at 2:44 p.m. Thomas notarized both, labeled each in a separate manila folder with his neat block handwriting, and placed them in the briefcase. He said I would have certified copies within 3 business days, and that he retained the originals in his office files. We shook hands at the front door. He walked to his Volvo. I stood on the porch in the October afternoon and watched him back out of the driveway and drive west on Elmwood Drive until he was gone. Then I went inside. I washed the 2 coffee cups we had used. I put them back in the cabinet. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the garden beds I would need to put to sleep for winter in the next week or 2, at the garage where the F-150 sat waiting for the hinge pin I had finally sourced from a parts supplier in Dayton. Everything still, everything quiet, everything exactly as it had been. I started a fresh pot of coffee I did not particularly need. It was a habit, some habits you keep, because the rhythm of them is its own kind of steadiness. I did not tell Diane that day. I did not tell her that week. I want you to understand why. Because I think the reason matters more than the timing. I was not building toward a confrontation. I was not waiting for the right moment to produce the documents and watch her face. That is not the kind of man I am, and it is not the kind of story this is. What I was doing was making sure, absolutely sure, that what I had decided was what I actually wanted, that it came from somewhere solid and permanent in me, and not from a wound that might close over in a week. I had been an engineer for 31 years. I do not change a load-bearing structure on impulse. On the morning of November 4th, a Saturday, I waited until after breakfast. Diane was reading at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. I sat down across from her and I told her, without raising my voice and without any particular ceremony, that I had been thinking carefully for several weeks about the direction of our marriage and that I had concluded, without anger and without blame, that we had reached a point from which I did not believe we were coming back. I told her I had already updated my will. I told her I had retained Thomas Eckhart, and that she should retain her own attorney if she chose to. I told her the house was in my name. I had the 2004 refinancing documents that established this clearly, and that I was not asking her to leave immediately, but that I wanted her to understand where things stood. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at me and said, "Because of your mother." I said, "That was the night I stopped pretending I didn't already know." She asked if there was anything she could say that would change my mind. I said no, and I meant it with the specific, settled certainty of a man who has sat alone in a dark kitchen for 4 weeks, reading his own handwriting, and never once found a doubt. Her attorney was a man named Craig Fessler, a family law practitioner on Bethel Road. He reviewed the updated will and trust documents and found them fully consistent with Ohio law. There was nothing to contest. I had acted within my rights at every step. The divorce proceedings were straightforward. We filed in December, and the decree was finalized on March 14th of the following year. I signed the papers at Thomas's office on Dublin Granville Road at 10:30 in the morning. It took approximately 20 minutes. Thomas and I shook hands. I drove home in the Malibu. My mother still comes for Sunday dinner. She is doing well. Dr. Simmons says her cardiac numbers have been stable for the past 2 readings, which is the best news she gives at any appointment. My mother still drives herself to church and to the Kroger on Livingston Avenue, and she calls me when she needs anything further. I come. That is the arrangement, and it is a good one, and it will continue for as long as she wants it to. The F-150 is nearly finished. I found the hinge pin from the supplier in Dayton. A new old stock piece, original spec, exactly right. And the door swings level and clean now. The sound it makes when it closes, exactly the sound a door that age should make. I am not in a hurry to finish the rest of it. Some work is worth doing slowly and without rush, because the discipline of doing it right is part of what the work gives you. My father used to say something when I was young and impatient, and convinced that speed was a virtue. He said, "The most important structures are the ones nobody sees. They hold everything up. They ask for nothing. And when they fail, if they ever fail, everything above them fails too." He was talking about footings and foundations. He was also, I think, talking about men. Some men deal with a failing foundation by screaming at it, by demanding that it hold. I am not that kind of man. I dealt with it the way I deal with everything that matters, by sitting with it long enough to understand it, by documenting it carefully, and by making a quiet call to a 62-year-old attorney with a 20-year-old briefcase, and trusting the process to do what processes do when you have prepared them correctly. A Thursday afternoon, 2 signatures, a pot of coffee gone cold, and a decision that still stands today. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.